Aggregate demand, Part 1, the basics. Demand curves should be a familiar idea from microeconomics, and we're now going to look at the macroeconomic equivalent, the summation of all demand that happens within the economy for all the different goods and services that we might study in micro. The definition of aggregate demand is the total spending on goods and services in an economy over a period of time at each price level. The spending can be divided into four key components: consumption, the spending by individuals within society; spending by the government; spending by firms on purchasing capital, which is investment; and net exports, the total value of exports being sold by the country, and then subtracting the total value of imports being brought into the country. Okay, these are our four areas of spending which we will look at individually. So adding up those various sectors will give us our total aggregate demand, and the equation C plus G plus I plus X minus M will be familiar from calculating GDP. And this shouldn't be a surprise, as we were calculating GDP by the expenditure method, how much money was being spent in the economy. And if we're defining aggregate demand as the amount of spending happening in the economy, then of course those two things should be equal at the given level of GDP. The spending will equal the value of goods being sold. So the aggregate demand curve will look very familiar to people who've studied microeconomics. There is a downward sloping demand curve, and there is a rough equivalent of price and quantity on the axes. But there are some key differences, and while we can kind of conceive of it like a demand curve, in reality they are kind of developed in fairly different ways. The vertical axis, APL, average price level, or you can just use price level, is looking at the weighted basket of goods that we use to measure inflation. And we'll look at what that basket contains when we study inflation in a later unit. So it's not just the price of one good, but the average prices of goods across the economy. And on the horizontal axis, our GDP, real GDP, so having adjusted for price level, of course, which is on the other axis, is the amount of goods being produced in society. So not the quantity of one good, but the total output of all the different goods. And the aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the price level and real GDP. So there are three reasons here why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, and these are different from the reasons that the microeconomic demand curve was downward sloping. In microeconomics, we had the income effect and the substitution effect as the reasons the curve was downward sloping. Here we have some different reasons. The first is the real wealth effect. What this means is that as the price level goes up, people's assets become worth less. And as their assets become worth less, they become less willing to spend money within the economy as they worry about the total value of the assets they have left. They may decide to save more to regain that value. The second effect, the trade effect, is simply that as our prices go up here compared to other countries, then our exports become less competitive and people will spend less on them, and at the same time imports from overseas will become more competitive and we're likely to spend more on them. So there'll be a swing away from export spending towards import spending within our economy. And the third effect here is the interest rate effect. As the price level goes up, interest rates tend to go up too. So the nominal rate will increase as the inflation rate goes up in order to keep real interest rates the same. Again, we'll look more at real and nominal interest rates later when we do monetary policy. But essentially here, the rising interest rate puts people off from spending or investing, and again, will decrease the amount of spending happening in the economy. Hopefully it's clear that a shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve, so more spending happening or more GDP at each price level, will be an increase in aggregate demand, and a shift to the left of aggregate demand will be a decrease. There is lower output at each price level, less spending happening within the economy. Just as within microeconomics, we need to again make the distinction between a shift of the curve and a movement along the aggregate demand curve. So the aggregate demand curve will shift, as we can see on the left here, it's increasing, when one of the components of aggregate demand changes. That would be the consumption, government spending, investment, or net exports. It is not to do with the price level changing. Whereas on the right we can see a move along the curve, and this is caused by the price level changing, but the actual levels of C, G, I, X and M within that are not changing. So this is very, very similar to micro, a shift of the curve when there is a change in a non-price determinant and a move along the curve when there is a change in price. Of course, it would be logical to assume that the change in price here would result from a shift in the aggregate supply curve. So the aggregate demand curve, as I said, shall be familiar in some regards from the microeconomic study of demand, but there are some key differences. It is a downward sloping demand curve. We're measuring the average price level against real GDP, and we shall look more at the determinants of aggregate demand in the next part of this video.